So we've been getting a lot of questions probably in the last 3 to 5 years about why are we seeing so much of this potassium deficiency. And I don't know how well you can see the picture, but this is soybeans, and we see it in soybeans, we see it in corn. And as I go back through my career, I've always seen some potassium deficiency, but it's been very limited up until the last, I'm going to say 5 or 6 years, and maybe longer than that. So that's what this presentation is about, is to try and address this a little bit and try and get a better understanding of why we're seeing it now when we didn't used to see it as much. And you're probably, I don't know how well you can see my screen. So what I did is I came up with some questions. Basically, I asked myself to try and help. Maybe these are the questions you guys are asking too, but so we know we have some problems with potassium. We see it all over the place. So my questions are, it's kind of self-reflecting a little bit too. Are our soil testing systems that we're using, are we properly identifying where we have low potassium levels and where we don't? Is that a part of our problem? Are there environmental factors? Has something changed environmentally, basically weather-wise, that we're seeing today that we didn't see 10 years ago? Is that part of the problem? Are there other nutrient interactions? Are we seeing something where it's not just potassium, but it's something else in conjunction with potassium that maybe we're missing along the way? And then finally, and this gets thrown under the bus quite a bit, is the tri-state recommendations. And are the tri-state recommendations properly modeling the soil tests, and are we putting enough potash on in effect? And I decided to give you all my answers, at least right up front. So if you're bored, you can go to sleep now. But really the answer is it depends on all these. And I'm going to walk through these a little bit. And that's probably, I think, in the end, what we're really dealing with here is that we really like to have binary answers. Yes, no. We want to say, yes, it's the tri-state recs. They're all screwed up. That's our problem. We're done. But the reality of this is that there's a whole bunch of things that are going on here. And the answer really is it depends. And if we can start there, now we can start to tear it apart and start thinking about how do we reconstruct this thing to make it work better. And also to understand that everything I'm going to tell you is not going to be earth-shattering. We're not starting all over. There's not this magic bullet. There's not this special equation that's going to fix everything. It's our ability to compile better and better data to get better and better answers. So the first thing I want to do is I want to start with the soil testing side of things. And some of you have heard this lecture about soil sampling because that's what we do at Integrated Ag. We do a ton of soil sampling. But I think it's really important that we critically evaluate those systems and really similar systems that a lot of agronomists use across the Midwest. Stole this slide from Ohio State. I think it's really important that we set the difference between precision and accuracy. And when it comes to soil sampling, we're never going to be perfect on either. But our goal is to be something. What? There, yeah, you can't really even see that. We want to be as accurate as possible, but we're probably never going to be absolutely precise, just because of the nature of the beast of what we deal with. But that's still good enough. That's way better than we've been ever. So there's nothing wrong with this. It's just important that we set reasonable expectations so now we can build our system around that and make sure that we can match up with what our capabilities are. So what really changed things for us was back in 2012, we put into production our own automated soil sampler. And what changed that for us was the fact that now we can take a lot of samples really fast. And because of that, we can take a lot more samples. So philosophically, what makes us different is that every time that knife goes in the ground, it's taking a sample and it's giving us a soil test result. Where a lot of cases, a lot of the systems out here, we talk about zone sampling, or we talk about grid sampling like on 2.5 acre grids. Well, we're talking about grid sampling on half acre, third acre, really, really high density stuff. And this system allowed us to do that, and it allowed us to do it at a price point that we can sample and it really comes down to what we're talking about is we all know the more data we get, the better information we get, the better decisions we make. But there's a cost to that data. And that's true in the soil sampling business too. So if our costs are real high, we just can't afford to take a lot of samples. So by automating it, we were able to drive those costs down, which allows us to take more soil tests. That in turn gives you better information. Wish we could see these better, but this is over at the Beck's Research Farm here in London. We did a project with them. I think it was 2016, 17, something like that. And really what the project was is on the left-hand side, the folks from Beck's went out and soil sampled on 2.5 acre grids, and they did it the way they would normally do it with a soil probe and with a four-wheeler. The center slide is we did half acre grids, and we did it with our sampling machine. And then on the, I guess, depends how you're looking at it, on your right-hand side, this is the map that we generated. And I know you can't see this, but we are able with half acre grids, and it's a really good way to kind of test yourself if you're doing a good job. A simple way is we are able to identify those higher organic matter areas and those lower organic matter areas very accurately. It actually is way better than what we can get out of a soil survey. And so if we can do that with organic matter, which is one of the things we test for, then we should be able to do that with the macro and micronutrients too, the phosphorus, the potassium, and so forth. And we can. But it takes 119 soil tests to do that. You can't do that with 21 soil tests. So that's why we have to have high density to be able to create zones that we can now create prescriptions for, like seeding recs and fertilizer recs and so forth. There's another piece to the automated sampling side of it that I think sometimes we don't talk about a lot anymore, and that is how do we attain accuracy in soil sampling? One of the big problems is simply how we collect soil samples. The traditional method is to use a soil probe. Put the soil probe in the ground, you collect the sample, you put it in a bucket, mix it up a little bit, put it in a bag, and send it off to the lab. But the problem is that depending on soil conditions, it's very much a human operated system. The man or the person, the woman, the person on the probe, if they push that probe in too deep, and I can just tell you, there's no doubt that virtually every field in Ohio at this point has nutrient stratification. You're going to see accumulated nutrient values towards the surface, and you're going to see lower nutrient values as you go deeper. The reason for that is we're no longer moldboard plowing. We're no longer mixing the full soil profile. So even though you may be doing some sort of vertical tillage or some even deep tillage chisel plowing, you're not mixing that profile equally. So from a sampling standpoint, if we probe too deep, we're going to get lower nutrient values. And if we probe too shallow, we're going to get higher nutrient values. And that is totally dependent on the person that's on the probe as to whether they do it. And I'm not here to say, well, if you do a good job, you won't have that problem. That's really not correct at all. Because there are times when that ground is so hard that you just can't get the probe in the ground, or you're seeking out a crack in the ground to try to get the probe in the ground, and all of a sudden the probe goes in the ground 9, 10, 12 inches, or it'll only go in the ground 3 or 4 inches. The reality of it is that's what happens when you use a soil probe. In our system, you saw the knife going in. It's hooked to a 100, 150 horsepower tractor that has hydraulics on it that's pushing that knife in the ground every single time. The operator doesn't worry about the knife being in the ground. He's worried about collecting a good sample. That's really a big deal. And we should probably talk more about that, because if we screw that piece up, then our results are going to be skewed from that point forward. Once again, you can't see these slides, but so what we did here is the next question is so everything that's been done, all the research that's been done on soil fertility is built around the idea of using a soil probe. So we've changed all that, and we're using what we call a furrow slice. So our question to ourselves is how well does that model? Are we seeing the same kind of results if we use a probe or we use our furrow slice knife? And what we did here is we went out and we sampled, I forget, it was on quarter-acre grids. I think it was around 200 samples in about a 55-acre field. And we ran our sampler, we analyzed those results, and then we went back in and we sampled with a probe basically right in the furrow slice. So we knew exactly where we needed to take the probe, and we analyzed those. So then we compared those two together, and these are your R-squared values, and they're someplace between 0.7, 0.8, which in all we did is we just compared those sample points to each other, and that means that they're matching up really pretty good, actually very good. So, and we've done this a couple other times, so we don't have to worry about our sampling system having to recalibrate, or it's just flat wrong. We know that it models very well, so we can continue using all the fertility research data that's been accumulated over the last 100 years. The next part is sampling density. And so we can take as many samples as we want with this system. There is a cost to it. And so we had to figure out what was that right sample density. And probably the easy answer is as many as you can afford. But the reality is what we settled on is half-acre grids is pretty good. And how we did that is we would sample the field. We sampled 1/8-acre grids. That means every 75 feet we took a soil sample, and then we started to drop the points out and compare to that 1/8-acre grid. How closely did it map or model? And that's what this data here is. And once again, we've done this several times. Part of this, the far side over here, the far left, that's the data we did with Bex. But once again, we compared the data as far as what, in this case, I think we were comparing to quarter acres, to halves, to ones, and I think 2.5-acre grids. So what you see here is that we've got R-squared values over here where we've got half-acre grids of about 0.75 on virtually every nutrient. And we get over here into 2.5-acre grids, we're getting R-squared values of about 0.25. And really what that means to us is we can do pretty good. As we go, if we were to show you the data where we did quarter-acre grids, it would be better than halves, but that curve starts to flatten out. So that gets us to now we're just saying, what is the most economical way to do it? And the other part is when you start to look at comparing to things like 2.5-acre grids, the more traditional way of sampling, or zone sampling, your R-squared values fall apart, which means we have a very difficult time modeling that when we get to that sparse of data. And we see that, you will visually see that on a map where the map gets really, really blurry. Again, another slide you can't see, but so this is some work that was done out of, I believe, Ontario. And there's several research projects that have been done this way. And what it amounts to here is what we have to do is we have to interpolate, stand over here. And what that means is we have to estimate. We got a soil sample point here and a soil sample point here. And we're trying to estimate between those points to create a map that we can then apply fertilizer. Well, this big green line here is where basically that's 100 meters. That's basically 2.5 acre grids. And the problem is that you just get almost no correlation when you have your data points that far apart, which means that our estimations are just not very good at all. Where we need to be is someplace in this 20 to 30 meter range, which is roughly about 100 feet, 120 feet. And we can do that with our system. And that gets us to the place where now we can start to get these estimates that really make a lot of sense. And for those of you that have been in our high density systems, you've seen that. The maps start to make sense. It starts to get, yeah, that land formation, that's a side of a hill, and that makes sense why the nutrient levels are lower or higher. And you won't get that when you do wide sampling. So this all started back in 2012. So we've been doing this now for about 13 years, and we feel really, really good, and it's been very successful. So I think a lot of our customers feel very, very good that more soil sample data is better. But there's another side to this. And so there's what we call the temporal stability or temporal instability. And that is the change over time. And I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about that because it's a part that most agronomists really never get to because they don't have this high density data. There's enough noise in the data, they never get to trying to figure out why there's additional noise because of change over time. So on this slide here, we started back, I think this was 2015. And so we sampled the field over and over again. And mostly just wanted to validate that what we were doing was accurate. But what we ran into is this was the sampling in the spring of 15. And if you look at the gold or red areas, those are kind of marginally low potassium levels. So we came back in the fall. So we did it in the spring of 15. We came back in the fall of 15, and it modeled pretty good. The gold areas match up pretty well. Little difference, but in the world of this precision versus accuracy, that's pretty good in soil fertility means. So then we came back in 2016 in the fall, and we saw this drop of about 15%. And we were applying additional potassium. This is a potassium map, by the way, to fix those gold areas, those moderately low areas. And we were going backwards. And this is what we see over and over again. And this is the temporal instability that a lot of times we don't talk very much about. So as we move forward and we talk about why are we seeing problems with potassium, and it has, so the answer is yes, it does have something to do with our soil sampling schemes. Because, and I guess I'll keep moving. I've got more data here to show you. And one of the things that's great, because we have our own lab and we have our own personnel to do all the sampling, is we have the luxury of being able to do a lot of testing. And at volumes that I don't know of anybody that can do the volumes that we do when it comes to testing. So this was a 155 acre field. It was sampled in the fall of 2023. And if you remember the fall of 23, it was fairly dry. And the farmer was concerned that when we sampled this field, that because it was so dry, we may have some erroneous data coming back. And so we turned around and we sampled it again. So this is a 644 soil sample data set, huge data set. And what we saw was it was in fact some differences. The blue was the October when it was dry, and the orange was the November when it was a little wetter. And guess what? We saw about an 8% from the mean. It was about a 7% variation from the mean from one to the other. Actually, it was about 14% from one to the other and about 7% from the mean. So we did see some differences, and guess what too? And we see this anecdotally all the time. Our agronomists see this all the time, that potassium is the one that's going to fall apart faster than anything else. The second one is soil pH will fall apart faster than anything else from a temporal instability standpoint. Those are the two that give us problems. So now we're going to go to another project, another field, and this is, Corey just talked about this one. So we're working with the 4Rs and in conjunction with Ohio State, which is just awesome to be able to have these kind of projects and work jointly with them. So what we did here is we soil sampled this field 3 times in 1 year, and we did it on 3rd-acre grids. And we actually, I think Brian's here. Brian really paid attention, and we set it up so we sampled exactly on the same spot all 3 times. So not only were we on the same pass, we were in the same exact spot where the last sample was taken. And so that's a really, really rich data set. That's 1,571 soil samples. That is a lot of soil samples. But we see the same thing. When I put it out here and we look at those three different times of sampling, that's what we're showing here. And there we see that potassium bouncing around again. And it's bouncing around about plus or minus 10% from the mean. And we're trying to get an understanding of why that is. Now, the other problem that goes into this is I would love to be able to tell you, well, all we got to do is just not soil sample when it's dry and we've solved our problem. But it doesn't work that way, because in this case here, we sampled when it was wet, we sampled when it was dry, and we sampled when it was wet, and the numbers just bounced around. And it's important that we understand that we cannot solve this problem completely by simply saying we're only going to sample when it's not too dry. And the other problem is we don't know what too dry is. We can be cognizant of it, but it's not our total answer. So what are our challenges here? And the number one problem we've got with temporal instability is it is unknown. We do not know exactly why those numbers bounce around the way they do, particularly with potassium, somewhat with soil pH, and some of the other nutrients will bounce too. We do know the soil makeup makes a difference, particularly the amount of clay in the soil, that has an impact. We understand that. We have a difficult time measuring that, though. I wish we had, each clay type broken down and we had a calibration factor we could put in, but there's nothing like that exists. Seasonal nutrient cycling, that can be a part of this, where you have a crop that's pulling a lot of potassium out of the soil to build the factory, and it's naturally going to lower soil test values some, but honestly, the amount of that exchange that's going on there is very, very difficult to measure with the soil test. It doesn't affect the soil test values very much. Soil biology, soil health, we're talking a lot more about that these days. I think we've got a tremendous amount to learn there, but I don't think there's any doubt that a healthier soil means that we're going to be able to, the plant can take up the potassium more efficiently, but also the biology in the soil is happening such that it can recharge quicker too. But the problem is that we really don't have particularly as it pertains to potassium, we don't have a good way to measure that. We don't have an algorithm that says if soil health this, potash this, or potassium this. We just know that there's an interaction. I talked about it, wet weather, dry weather. We know that has an interaction. It's very frustrating for us because we will sample 100 fields, and 75 of those fields in dry conditions, 75 of those fields, we see no problems whatsoever. But then we'll get this random one every once in a while where we'll see a number, what I call a flyer. It'll just not match up with what we've seen historically. So for us to go to the weather piece, it's very difficult for us to look at that and say, well, we just don't sample. Crop removal, nutrient additions, these can have some effect too. Not significantly unless we're doing some massive sort of correction, like a manure application or something like that. But all these things go into that temporal instability. And it's a big enough deal if we're going to try and build a better potassium recommendation. We need to try and do a better job of figuring out how to handle this. So how does this all tie back together? Well, first of all, on average, you can expect, particularly potassium, to bounce about 12% plus or minus. So whatever your soil test value is, you have to understand that that value can change by 12% higher or 12% lower, depending on what's going on that day. The challenge with that is so we get into these, what I'll call gray areas. We get into a soil test value where we're right there between being a crop removal and maybe it's between crop removal and applying nothing in a high soil test value, or a crop removal and we're going into buildup. Well, so when you see these gold areas again and the orange areas, those are areas that are in that range. So if we're off by 12%, that could throw that into an area where we should be applying potash and we're not. Or it can throw us into an area where we really are not going to see any response to potash, but yet we're applying it. And to make things worse, and once again, critically evaluating our systems, when we soil sample, we have historically soil sampled every 4 years. And we use that same soil test for that 4 years. So if we've got that area that we're saying, hey, this area right here, it's marginal, we think we just need crop removal, but in reality, it's in a low area, it needs buildup. We're going to do that for 4 years in a row. Nothing's going to change other than the crop removal piece will vary based on yield removals. But as far as a buildup goes or a teardown goes, we're locked into that for 4 years. And what that does is that puts us on this roller coaster of in those marginal areas. And this doesn't represent, every acre. This represents those marginal areas within those acres where we can be wrong. And if we're wrong 4 years in a row. To the tri-state piece, I guess there's some cushion built into the tri-states, but really, I've never seen anything where I've never really seen a lot of people talk about this temporal instability and how to manage it. And quite honestly, the management isn't on the recommendation side. It's really on how we collect better data to feed into that recommendation. So Evan touched on this, and we introduced this to some of our key growers here to try and explain it. And I was glad I did, because out of that, I kind of learned how to explain it better maybe and some of the pitfalls. But so what we're proposing is we know we need high density soil sampling. We absolutely need high density soil sampling. But we don't need to take that high density sampling all at one time. If we split that up, so instead of doing samples every 4 years, we're going to do samples every 2 years. And we're going to take half as many each time we sample. And that's what this map represents here. We end up with 3/8 of an acre grids. But what we would do is we would come in and sample on 3/4 acre grids, And then 2 years later, we would come back in. And technology, it's just amazing how we can use technology these days to do things we never even thought about. So this becomes very, very practical for us from a sampling standpoint, because all we've got to do is shift our AB line over, and then our operators can go into the field and can match up very accurately where they need to sample. So what ends up happening is we maintain the high quality data we need from a spatial standpoint, from a spacing standpoint, but we create this rolling average, which gives the agronomist the ability to look at the soil test values over time in a 2-year increment. And so we really only have 1 or 2 applications before we're always updating again. And it comes back to this precision versus accuracy. We're never going to be perfect, but what it does is it keeps us closer to the mark over time. And if we do this right, we can do this and not break the bank in the process, which is always a part of this. We can't just spend unlimited amount of money on something like soil sampling. This is just another example. This here is we sample on 1 acre grids, then we turn around 2 years later and split it. We sample again on 1 acre grids, and that ends up giving us this half acre grid. Pretty slick. So I've hit on a lot of these points. We're simply have to maintain high density. Now, what is high density? We've got lots of programs, and we'll touch on this in a bit, but we need as much as we can afford to sample. We're going to divide it in half, sample every 2 years instead of every 4 years. Come back to the GIS software is really good. And one of the questions that came out of it is okay, Dave, what if we make a lime application and then we're turning around and sampling right after that lime application? Because we'll sample and then the lime will be applied, then we'll sample again. And the beauty of this is we can look at those soil tests independently. We can look at just this year, or we can look at that rolling average. And I think in those situations, we'll look at both. Many times, what we do is we do a mathematical calculation. It says based on this pH, based on the buffer pH, this is how much lime we're going to apply. Well, this gives us 2 chances to look at that and get it right. It gives us 2 chances to look at and get every nutrient right. And this really is a way for us to tackle this temporal instability and do it without breaking the bank. So that's the soil sampling side of things. So that's our look inward. So are there other factors, environmental factors? Are there other nutrient interactions that are going on as far as it pertains to potassium? Pretty important question, really. So what we did is once again, you can't read any of this, but if you look up there and you see yellow, we went into 21 different fields, and we went to those spots that we saw potassium deficiency. And we had no problem finding those spots. And guess what? Everything in yellow says that this was a plant tissue test. So we took plant tissue samples. We were measuring what's in the plant. Every single spot had low potassium, very low potassium. I mean, really low potassium. And so that's no big surprise. That's what we would have expected. So then if you go over and you see the blues, the first blue is calcium, and the one that's almost every one is blue is magnesium. Magnesium is a cation, just like potassium is a cation. And over my 40-some year career, I've seen this over and over again. Now, this is fairly unique to these prairie soils. Madison County has a lot of these kind of soils where we have some pretty high magnesium levels in our soils. And it by itself is not a problem. Potassium by itself is not a problem. But if you have both those things conflicting with each other, where you have extremely high magnesium levels and you've got moderately low potassium levels, it really, really puts pressure on that plant. It just can't take up enough potassium when that happens. So this is a key factor. This is where we're looking at, okay, there's an interaction with another nutrient. We're measuring those nutrients. We're measuring them at a high density. Maybe we can put together something that looks at both those, not just potassium as our only source to drive whether we need potash or not. The other piece is the calcium, which is also a cation. You can look up there and see the blue. There is some relationship there, but very, very difficult to match that one up. I think there are some situations where I've seen it is if any of you are using any kind of biosolids, most of the biosolids have almost no potassium in them. But they're also part of the treatment is to treat it with some sort of calcium hot lime to react it to kill all the bad bacteria out of it. I've seen, and I honestly never put it together until about the last 2 years, where we would see these incredible potassium deficiencies in these fields where biosolids have been applied. And I think what's happening is we're flooding that soil with so much calcium because of the biosolids, and they're not putting any potassium back in. We just throw that plant into massive potassium deficiencies. It's really kind of an anomaly. Most of you in this room don't even deal with any of that, but it does kind of put common sense to the chemistry that's going on. I always like to use Liebig's Law. That's kind of my go-to, but it's important that when we talk about soil fertility that we're not going to have any success raising the stave in the barrel that's not the bottom stave. We have to fill the bottom stave first, and then we go to the next stave, and we just keep plugging staves up, and that's how we increase yields. That's also why it's almost never happens where you're going to apply one product, whatever that product is, and you're going to instantly increase your yields by 20 or 30%. It's a process that we have to go through. The other piece that I like to remind myself and others is Liebig's Law is also, it's dynamic. You have relationships going on. I just showed you one where we have the relationship between magnesium and potassium. And those two together they determine whether that stave is the lowest stave or whether that stave is higher. But it's still the same thing. We have to figure out what that lowest stave is first before we go on to the next one. So out of this, Evan talked, we have been working really for years on this, trying to build indexes that it's kind of twofold. One is we needed a way that we could communicate with our customers and say, this is where you need more potassium and this is where you don't. And if we didn't build out an index, we've got to show you 4 or 5 or 6 different maps, and we got to look at them, and it's very, very difficult to understand why this area maybe potentially needs more potassium. So what we did is we took all this information that we've been collecting and we built what's called a K index or a KHDI. Out of this, we look at, and the key driver in this is still the key driver, and that is soil test K is still the most important thing we're looking at. And it's not, and it really, what that does is from a tri-state rec standpoint, we're still following very closely to the tri-state recs as far as K goes. Where we deviate from this a little bit is if we get these really high base sat mag levels, we get these soils in Madison County where we have really high magnesium levels, which by the way, I don't know how you drive those levels down. They're just kind of inherent to the soil. So I wish I could say, oh, we do these 3 things, we can lower the mag level, therefore we take pressure off the potassium. So we throw that into the mix and we build that into the index. So if you've got a soil that has got low potassium and very high magnesium, it's going to show up as being a very low index number, a 3 or a 4 or something like that. The other part that once again, through really just boots on the ground experience, but we saw it with this last go around with our testing, where we saw these, and this 2024 was the year to see this. So if it was good for anything, it was good for this, is where we saw these extreme potassium deficiencies. So we had low soil test K, we had very low potassium in the plant, we had extremely high magnesium in the plant, and these were on soils that were basically borderline. They weren't the sandiest soils, but they were those soils that a lower organic Crosby soil, if you know what that is. And really what it amounts to, it's not really so much about the soil as it is about the water holding capacity. These are the areas in the field that really struggled to be able to hold enough water to keep the plant growing. You throw that on top of low potassium levels, high mag levels, it just multiplies itself. And that's why we saw all these really extremely deficient K areas. It's when you had low K, high mag, and in areas that really don't do a good job holding water. So we built that into our K index. And we use organic matter, CEC, and slope. We put those together. It's what we call our CPU. We identify those areas that have the poorest water holding capacity, the poorest yielding areas, versus the ones that yield very well. You throw all that together, we've got 8 to 10 layers of data coming off of your farm, not just from soil test data, but from other layers of data. And we put those together and we create this index. So I come back to, this is why it's so important that we have this index, is now we can show you this layer right here. And this is your K index layer. And the rating is from 0 to 9, 0 being terrible, 9 being great. And you can quickly look at that and go, those red areas are where my potassium issues are. The other thing that was really cool about this is, when I know this field because it's my field, or actually my brother's field, is I didn't know what that K index was when I took the plant sample, but it was in that area right where it's bright red. So it matched up perfectly. And I'm going to show you some others, and it's just amazing how these indexes really matched up well. So the other thing is, now we can start to tear into some data management. We don't just have to look at it from the standpoint of, Dave says that this is what you need to do. We need it. And really, that's another important point, is you need to challenge yourself to always question, always test what somebody's telling you. So if I'm telling you this, you need to test this on your farm and see how well that works for you. So what we did is we broke the yields down for this field by these index levels. And that's what we've got here. And so on the less than 4, the dry yield corn in this field made 172. The next level up was 213. The next level up was 241. Next level up was 249, and the highest was 252. Well, that's that stair step you want to see. So that's the last slide I should show you, because that's what it's supposed to look like. Now, I got to warn you on this, is that we are combining layers of data. And one of the key layers of data that we're combining is the CPU layer. And the low CPUs are identifying where we have our lowest yield potentials. So you're never going to get a number 4 or an index 4. You're not going to apply potash and turn it into index 7. But what we can do is we can test it. We can apply strips across this field and see if we get a response to that 4 by applying potash. And that's pretty cool. So this is this test field that Corey was talking about, and we did the index on this field, and it models really fairly closely to what Corey was showing you that they were doing by strictly soil test K value. And the reason for that is that these areas, this field has really got pretty good soil test K value. And it does not have a magnesium issue. The only thing that's that's involved in this, that's not involved in her data, is we're using that CPU data to create this index. So that's a part of it. But just remember once again that we really don't have very much, really no low soil test K in this field. A little bit of high, but not low. So I'm tearing that data apart just a little bit different than what Corey did. So we did those strips. She showed you that, where we did every other pass where we made an application, and then the other pass we didn't. So that allowed us to be able to go in and do the comparison we're talking about. Let's look at what happens if we do not apply potash, and if we do apply potash, and we're using the index as our indicator as to where we should or shouldn't do it. And just like what Corey showed, this area was pretty dry last year, especially late in the season. We did see just a little bit of a bump from 173 to 171 where we applied. That's not enough. That's not enough to say that there was a response to potassium. It's just not. I didn't do the stats on it. And a way I can tell you that is we saw an inverse on the highest index where we actually saw yields go down a little bit where we applied potash versus where we didn't. I think the real message here is that we always need to think broadly, and that is that if we've got really dry weather and we've got soils that don't have good water holding capacity, they're not going to yield as well. And the other is what we're trying to measure here is soil test potassium, and if the whole field's in pretty good shape, you would not expect to see much difference. So this is a soybean field. Same thing. This is the index we've created. And the same thing, these areas here, I did not know the index. I just went to where I saw the potassium deficiencies, and it just right on the money when we did look at them. From a yield perspective, it starts down at 42.7 and ends up at 64. Again, do not think that you're going to get a 22 bushel yield increase by applying potash on those low areas, but it is a really strong indicator that we would see some sort of response. We did not do a study on this. These fields here were just comparing what we saw plant tissue versus the index versus yield. So there is opportunity there. That's pretty significant. That's very significant, actually. So here's another one. And I find this interesting too. So this field has got almost no low potassium levels in it. It's got a lot of high potassium in it. But the big thing is this is an irrigated field. And this comes back to the interactions, the relationships we have with all these different things. And if we can solve the water problem, then our nutrient problems become much less of an issue. And that's what we see here. In this case, actually, the 7, the highest, was the lowest, and 4 and 5, which typically we would see lower, was actually pretty darn good. Why? Because it had water. If it has water, it doesn't have to have a luxury amount of potassium to work. This is also why we got to understand that in 2023, we didn't see near the potassium issues that we saw in 2024. 2024 was a really dry year for most of us, especially in that rapid growth stage going into grain fill. It doesn't mean what we're doing is wrong. It just means we have to keep it in context. So the last question is what about these tri-state RECs? Do they meet maximum economic yield? And I think it's the MEY is important. We're just not, they aren't built, and we aren't built for yield contests. We're not trying to apply potash to raise high yield anything. We're trying to apply potash to make you some money. So it's important to keep that in context. So the way the tri-states work is you have this chart right here, which does a nice job of explaining it. If you've got low soil test K, we're going to apply buildup plus crop removal. If you have medium soil test K, you're going to apply crop removal. And if you have high soil test K, you're not applying anything. And if you think about going back to that field that Corey was talking about, that field has medium to high soil test K values. We're seeing no response to additional K. And we've got 1,570 soil samples telling us that. So it makes sense. But I will also tell you, when you look at this map here, so that's the soil test map. This is the as applied map, or the recommendation side of it, actually. I come back to, if we are wrong, and we're saying that area that doesn't have anything applied on it, if we are wrong, if we don't take into account that temporal stability, then we're going to be wrong for 4 years in a row. And I come back to, that's that roller coaster where we're not applying, we're not applying, we're not applying, then we apply. And it just, I think, builds a case for why we really need to look at doing these 2-year cycles versus 4-year cycles. So a lot of words here. And the way I'm addressed this is yes or no. So are the tri-state RECs working? So the first one is no, they're not, because they only measure soil test K, and that's it. And they're based on 3 states, and they're based on all kinds of agronomy. They're not based on high density soil sampling. And particularly if we move into the temporal stability piece, that becomes the yes part. If we use the index, we use all this data, the tri-state RECs are okay. They're going to work just fine. So it's really a data problem. It's not a recommendation problem, at least in that case. It comes back to the large grid. I don't know how, because there are a lot of agronomists, if you want to get in a fight in the agronomy world, talk about grid sizes and zone sampling versus grid sampling. I'm not interested in getting in a fight, but I'm just telling you, with all this data we're looking at, I don't know how anybody can look at me and say more data isn't better. The only argument it is how much are you going to pay to get more data? And that becomes, okay, let's find what that is. But we need more data if we're going to solve this potassium problem. And that come back to, so the yes side of this is if we have high density data, we can do pretty good with the tri-state recommendations. So then the next one is temporal instability can lead to repeated over and under applications. We've talked about that. No, that is a problem. And by doing this new sampling system, it takes care of that. It's really not a tri-state issue. It's a sampling issue. The weather stress piece of it, I come back to, that's the problem I've got with the tri-state RECs is it just doesn't account for that. And it's probably impossible because we've got so many different agronomists and farmers that use this that have varying kinds of data. But I also come back to, though, that if we have good data, the critical levels that they're using are pretty good. My only little gripe on the critical levels is I think we need to be on the higher side, not the lower side, to make them work. So wrap it all up. We need to do a good job of soil sampling. I hope you will consider using the rolling average. I think that is an awesome tool to help us do a better job in the future. I hope we've got other indexes that we've built. We've got an index for manganese. We've got an index for zinc. We've got a phosphorus index. We've got to watch that because we got to really follow the tri-states, and it's close, but it's not exact. I hope someday maybe we can get them to adapt that, but we've got that too. So what else is up here? Sandier soils. We do have some guys, particularly our guys like out in New York, your CEC levels are not the same as they are here. We average 15 to 20 CECs, up to 30, 35 CECs in some soils. We get away from here and those CECs will be 10s, 11s. Get out in New York, they may be below 10, 7s, 8s. So as you get into more sandy soils, we need to think about doing more annual applications and less of the 2-year programs, which we tend to do a lot of. We need to use realistic goals when we do yield goals, but we need to make sure that we're trying to fertilize to build the factory, not just remove the grain. So if you want to build a 300 bushel factory, you may not get 300 bushel corn, but you want to build that factory. Because if you don't build the factory, you will not have 300 bushel corn. Really isn't, once again, this isn't far off from where we've been. Doesn't mean you plug in, unreasonable yield goals, 350 bushels. In our case, we tend to use crop removals as our yield goals, which I think is really good. The other side of it is we've had some guys that have gone to applying luxury amounts of potassium to offset all the things I've been spending the last 40 minutes talking about. And in all honesty, if we do this strategy, you can move away from doing the luxury amounts of potassium because you're going to pick all that up with the high density sampling, with the rolling average, and that takes away from needing to, in effect, over apply to compensate for this problem. So what is the best strategy? And you can, am I out of time? Am I over big time? All right. So I don't think I've only got 2 slides left. The main point here is that work with your agronomist to build the strategy that makes sense for you. It can be mixed and matched as far as densities go, but the other side of it is important when you get to what we're trying to do, it's going to cost, in this case, a 3/4 acre grid or a 3/8 grid size. That's a high density grid. It's going to cost $10.70 per acre. And these are all the things that you can leverage against that expense. And you don't have to do all of them. But for example, if you can save 60 pounds of potash, you've paid for it all. If you've reduced your phosphorus by 35 pounds, you've paid for it all. If you reduce your nitrogen rate by 20 pounds, you pay for it all. If you can do a variable rate sulfur application and use 45 pounds less, you pay for it all. If you use 450 pounds less lime, you pay for it all. The other side is you're talking about 2 bushels of corn and 1 bushel of soybeans to pay for it all. And there's government programs out here that are going to basically pay for the exact system that we're talking about here, and it's going to pay for it all. So it's in my mind, this is a no-brainer. It's just a matter of getting into a good system. That's it. We'll do questions.